On this show, we've spoken about many kinds of difficult emotional situations that we experience as people, from anger to sorrow, all those kind of things that really have a negative effect on our lives, but which many people might think kind of doesn't necessarily apply to them. There is one of those challenging emotions that I think applies to all of us, and that is guilt. Even the word guilt makes us feel a little guilty. Somehow we seem to think, I know that emotion isn't a good thing. Well, that's one of the things we need to question. I mean, there are some who say that guilt is a good thing. Could guilt be a good thing? Could it actually be healthy to be guilty in some way? So we'll have a look at that, and if not, maybe even if so, can we get rid of guilt? Is there a way to deal with guilt so that it doesn't become so paralyzing? Because if there's one adjective that applies to guilt, it is paralyzing. Certainly prevents people from doing a lot of stuff, prevents people from enjoying a lot of stuff, and creates a lot of negativity in people's lives. So let's have a closer look at what that's all about and perhaps what we can do to help ourselves. So when I talk about guilt, we generally do recognize guilt as a negative emotion. You know, I mean, there's many definitions and there's a lot that we can use to define guilt, but essentially guilt is a feeling of responsibility. It's often a misplaced responsibility, it's often related to something that perhaps we aren't even responsible for, and it can also be responsible for things that we've thought or things that we've done or things that we believe that we've done. But firstly, the idea that guilt could be a good thing, that it could be a healthy thing in some way, is based on the idea that essentially guilt motivates us to live according, firstly, to what we believe, and secondly, according to what might be socially acceptable. There is no doubt that guilt serves a powerful social function in kind of controlling our social behavior. There's certain boundaries we will not cross, and there are certain things that we will obey, or rules that we will obey, and those kind of things because of our feelings of guilt. And so from this arises the argument that guilt could be a healthy thing, that it's actually got a social and a psychological function to help us live in a society. Certainly, research does show that people who are inclined to feelings of guilt are generally people who work harder and perform better than those who aren't likely to feel feelings of guilt. And more importantly, perhaps, they are also perceived as very capable leaders. That's because people who experience feelings of guilt and expect that kind of reaction are people who tend to be more sympathetic to other people. They can more readily put themselves in other people's shoes, on the one hand, and think about the consequences of their behavior, on the other hand. And those two things, thinking about other people and thinking about the consequences of behavior, can prevent people from acting in a negative fashion. Hence, guilt is good for you. And leadership is an important, necessary, beneficial quality. We all would want a leader to be sympathetic, and obviously believing that you're responsible for something, and that awareness of other people, even if it's sometimes a bridge too far, is going to give us those qualities of greater empathy and greater awareness of the outcomes. So whether it's leadership that we're talking about or any other goal-oriented behavior, guilt is associated with the ability to anticipate outcomes of actions and modify those actions accordingly. Sounds like a good thing. Similarly, the very ability to experience guilt is generally associated with people who have some moral standard that they themselves value very highly. Whether it was inculcated into them or it arises from them themselves, it's like they hang on to their moral nature, and as a result of that, people who experience guilt are also people who are less likely to lie or to cheat or to steal or to behave in some kind of immoral fashion when dealing in business or dealing with relationships or dealing with other people in any kind of a way. And it's usually the people who are prone to feelings of guilt that don't get involved in business scams. Surprise, surprise, because, well, we've often all wondered, how does a person live with themselves when they rip somebody else off? Well, taking it one step further, we're saying that people who've got a feeling of guilty naturally are not likely to rip anyone off. I bet you know that about yourself. So we all experience a certain amount of guilt in some way. It goes as far down as some people won't even be slightly rude or impose themselves in any kind of a way, which is good, but we do know that sometimes it can go too far. And we also have seen guilt associated with people who become too timid to assert themselves in any kind of social or professional or other situation. And in fact, guilt is a symptom of depression. It's a common symptom of depression and is often related to things like childhood trauma and even extreme things like post-traumatic stress disorder. So, is guilt such a good thing after all? But the point that it really makes is that the idea that some emotions are inappropriate arises out of our natural emotional lives from early on in life. That's probably true. Whether that leads to a pathology or not is a different question. A more kind of cognitive approach is really that guilt is essentially an emotion that people experience because they think they've done something wrong. And so they think they've harmed someone or harmed something, and as a result, the thought that I've done something wrong is what causes the negative emotion. People who experience guilt continuously or chronically tend to live under the illusion that they are causing other people harm, or that they have caused someone harm that is an irreparable situation from the past. And in a very key point, they tend not to think it through logically. I mean, you know, one of the things I like to say is that guilt is essentially a legal term for responsibility. It's used as a legal term for responsibility. You are guilty of this in a court of law. And what's useful about comparing it to that court of law is that in a court of law you require evidence to prove that someone is guilty. And what's useful about that metaphor is that so much guilt that we personally experience is entirely without evidence because it's based on thoughts inside our heads. So sometimes you need to say to yourself, hang on a second, could I convince a judge that I'm guilty, that I actually did something? When you think it through, when you apply logic to the situation and try and think it through or explain it through, it often will fall apart. Feelings of guilt can also indicate a sense of unworthiness, and frequently feelings of guilt are related to feelings of poor self-worth, topic that we'll talk about in the future, and also kind of associated with very bad relationships with parents. People who have the past history of critical parents or abusive parents often have feelings of guilt because as a child they believe that the reason why their parents are ignoring them, neglecting them, abusing them, whatever it may be, is because they must have done something wrong. It is natural for a child to interpret things that way. And so that develops into feelings of guilt, and then is also associated with very destructive emotions like self-criticism. Because self-criticism gets into a repetitive negative state. People who are strongly self-critical tend to lack motivation. And then that gets into depression. And they also lack the strength to pull themselves out of it. So lack of willpower lack of self-control, lack of motivation, those all arise out of feelings of guilt, and it can become quite a dangerous, vicious circle. What's even worse about guilt, and then those situations, if it could be said to be worse, is that it's got this ability to be insidious. We often attach guilt to things that are in themselves either neutral or often even pleasurable. So we feel guilty about eating a particular food, or eating chocolate, or taking time off, or relaxing when we should be working. We feel guilty about doing things that are good and pleasurable. And we begin to associate guilt with pleasure. And eventually, pleasure becomes a bad thing. And you become a bad person because you indulge in it or want it. You know, there's a lot of undercurrent of the religious moralities that have fed into that over the years and have exploited that. Certainly, we have a strong framework in almost every religion that pleasure is bad. And so people who experience guilt are often religious people, and often that guilt is related to anything good. But it doesn't have to be religion, it doesn't have to be a religious person, it just has to be, I shouldn't be eating that chocolate, I know that it's bad for me, or I'm supposed to be on a diet and I ate that chocolate. So on the one hand, I'm guilty, and that's where we do become judge and jury as well, and therefore I'm a bad person. That itself can get people into a vicious circle, because the belief that you are a bad person lets you do bad things. It's not that controlled moral of the guilt that says, I'm feeling as a guilty person, I won't do anything to harm others. It's, I'm bad because I did this to myself. I indulged, I ate when I shouldn't have, I did those kind of things. So that makes me a bad person. And what is dangerous is that we can get ourselves into a much more negative situation than that. When we start thinking ourselves as a bad person, we don't have an incentive to fix that, because I know that I'm not going to succeed because I'm bad. I know that I'll never get to that conclusion of skinniness or whatever it may be because I can't control myself. I know that because I do eat the chocolate. So we draw the conclusion that as bad people, we're always going to engage in bad behavior. So we don't do anything to improve ourselves, and it just gets worse and worse, getting ourselves into a lot of trouble. Often, when we're trying to change a bad habit, like overeating or smoking or over-drinking, we start from a point of view that we are out of control in the first place. So I need to fix that because I'm doing this wrong. To be a good person, I shouldn't be eating that chocolate. The other thing is, we also tend to believe that in order to be a good person, I need to always do good. Because if I do one bad thing, I can't be a good person, surely. So we create this impossible standard for ourselves that literally is just irrational. Is it really possible for a person to be doing good all the time? Is there such a person as that? We always even feel that was a little bit weird, wouldn't we? So it's an irrational belief that to be a good person, I must always be good. And if I'm not always good, I must be bad. And that creates that vicious circle of guilt. We need to be a little bit more realistic. What is the point of abusing ourselves with guilt in the first place and beating ourselves up about it? It doesn't really make sense. If you make a mistake and act in a hurtful way, feeling guilty isn't going to change that. It's not going to make you fix it. It's not going to make you learn anything about it. It's not going to reduce the outcome in any kind of a way. So feeling guilty doesn't make it unlikely that you won't do the same thing again if you've already done it. As we saw, in a limited fashion, guilt might moderate people's behavior. But once you allow yourself to break the rule, then you become a bad person who's always capable of doing that. So guilt seems to have limited effect in benefiting us. Certainly, other people won't like us more or respect us more or think we're okay because we feel guilty about what we did for them. We would have to do something in return. So yeah, maybe we can't just get away with the stuff that made us feel guilty that maybe we did do to someone. But certainly the feelings of guilty are not what changes it. It's the doing something in response to that. So feeling guilty and pulling yourself down does not make you change your behavior. It puts you into a negative kind of vortex that says, well, I know me, I'm just going to do that again. You might be thinking, well, we still need that guilt to hold us accountable. But research indicates that it isn't feelings of guilt that makes us accountable. It's forgiveness that makes us feel accountable. If we are compassionate on ourselves, then we have a stronger feeling of responsibility, because we're acknowledging a kind of responsibility rather than acknowledging I'm a bad person, which you can't do while forgiving yourself. So forgiveness is the response we need to take to ourselves when we believe that we've done something wrong or harmed another person in some way. So yes, we can acknowledge it, but we must move towards forgiveness, not towards guilt, which says you're bad and you're going to do it again, but forgiveness that says there's hope for you yet, that even though you fail, you could succeed next time. So that's one thing, and research does show that people who forgive themselves tend to be more compassionate to other people, just like to themselves, and they also tend to take responsibility for their failures, rather than believing I'm a bad person, and I'm just going to do that again, and woe is me. So they're also able to receive feedback more, and able to take on that feedback more, and more likely to learn from their experience. Rationally acknowledge, I feel bad. Before I start beating myself up, let me see how I could forgive myself, because if I forgive myself, I also need to take responsibility to try and fix it. Guilt doesn't make us take responsibility to try and fix something. It just makes us feel responsible, end of story. One thing that you can really do, which is a really great way to move on and get over yourself, is to ask the person that you're feeling guilty towards if it's really a problem for them. Don't ask them, do you think I'm bad? Ask them, whatever it is that you think you did, is that actually a problem? Did that affect you? And if they say, no, it really isn't a problem for me, you might think, oh, they're just saying that to please me, or they don't want to hurt my feelings, or any of those kind of things. Don't invalidate someone else's words and reality by persisting in feeling guilty when they've said to you, hey, listen, you didn't do anything here. You actually have to let go and move on. If another person says to you, no, I don't know why you feel that, because I don't feel that about what you did, holding on to that becomes either a form of self-pity or is related to the other issues that I spoke about earlier on, such as low self-worth and self-criticism, in which case those are the things which really need to be addressed. It's also really important to even examine whether it is yours to be guilty about. Don't take on guilt that isn't actually yours. If the other person seems fine, if everything seems fine, you can ask, you can check out, does that have anything to do with me? And if not, move on. Get away from it. Because we are naturally egocentric. And actually a good way to kind of bust yourself is to realize, I'm being an egotist. That person doesn't place me at the center of what's going on in their lives. I'm not the cause and effect of everything in our lives. We place way too much importance on our thoughts and our actions in other people's eyes than they actually have. The thing that makes you feel guilty, such as an unintended insult or something that you said and that you're holding a lot of guilt about, the other person might not have noticed it, or they might have moved on. It might not have even penetrated their mind. and you're sitting there feeling guilty the whole time. Catch yourself feeling guilty and ask, hey, did I hurt your feelings? And if they say, I don't know what you're talking about, don't think they're being nice. Realize, don't think, I was just being silly, and move on. Very often, the behavior that you're tormenting with yourself with is something that the other person doesn't even know about. And the other thing is to learn how you're thinking, to learn to notice how you're thinking about something. We tend to think about these kind of things, the stuff that makes us feel guilty, in very black and white terms. All right, wrong and right, perfect and imperfect. And things are complex. Life is full of grey areas. And recognize that. Even if you have some level of responsibility somewhere, don't assume it all. Don't take guilt on. Don't take responsibility for stuff that isn't yours. Realize it can't possibly be as simple as I'm thinking. And let me look a little bit closely and really discover where is my role in that. In these kind of matters, we have a strong tendency to overthink things. Learn to recognize overthinking in yourself, because it's often a symptom of anxiety, continuous worry and self-analysis and overthinking. If it isn't yours, let it go. If they say it isn't yours, let it go. Then there's that guilt for something that we didn't do, but kind of wanted to do. I wanted the chocolate. I had lascivious thoughts about that person. It's important to recognize those kind of thoughts as natural parts of yourself. Something that's very important to understand is that, contrary to some people's beliefs, thought isn't action. Our minds are full of a million different things that come and go, and a lot of them, which arise out of the strange, mysterious nature of our minds, we must learn to recognize it's the weird stuff that arises. That even Freud would have told us. The attraction towards a parent or the wanting to have sex with a parent, Freud tells us in a child is actually a natural thing. It's a normal thing. Well, that could cause guilt in some. What we've got to learn is it's normal for certain thoughts to go through my head. If I find myself thinking about something, instead of feeling guilty because it's a bad thing, let's just apply the rational. Let's say, that ridiculousness. And it doesn't matter what it is. You can have the most terrible thought in your head. Don't freak yourself out. You tell yourself, the mind is full of those burblings. Let me just think that through for a moment here. Well, I'm not going to really do that. And then you'll be fine. Find yourself lusting for that person. Don't feel bad. Only feel bad if you actually act on that, and you shouldn't. Rather just think to yourself, there I go again. Don't tell yourself you're a bad person. So the mind is full of mysterious things, and allow yourself to process it a little bit more rationally. What is important, though, is that you mustn't push feelings below the surface. Just accept those thoughts are part of who I am. They arise naturally. They help alert me to my behaviors, but they are not behaviors themselves. If I'm feeling lascivious towards someone because there's another person in my life who I've been a little bit pushy with, and I think I can get away with things. And so it's made me think that. And although I haven't acted on, and that person will never know I had lustful thoughts towards them, it helped me rein myself in. If I'm being self-aware, and if I am recognizing that it's okay to have illicit thoughts as long as you don't act on them, and that sometimes those illicit thoughts, so to speak, can also help us identify other areas in our lives where we might have been behaving in a somewhat negative fashion as well. Another strategy is, of course, be more rational when you've broken the rules. If you ate that chocolate or something like that, be more rational. Don't beat yourself up about it. It's like you don't get a life sentence for a parking violation. So a small thing like eating the chocolate when you're on diet is not a major violation of anything. Even if it feels like that to you, that's really being unrealistic. Bring things down to their level of reality. Be rational. How do you know you're being rational? Look at the intensity and the duration and the consequences of that negative emotion or of that negative action. And look at it and realize it's such a small thing. Let me bring it back in. Be more rational about it. Accept yourself more. You can either decide to accept yourself as a human being, an imperfect human being, with limited knowledge, that's going to make mistakes sometimes, but can also forgive yourself and move on, or you're going to hate yourself and have a miserable life. That's guilt. Which one is it? Forgive yourself. Accept yourself. That is how we move on from guilt. Well, when we suffer from paralyzing emotions that we can all relate to, it's great to know that there's something we can do about it, and perhaps there's a different way to think about it too. So hopefully I can give you a few more different ways to think about things in the future. Don't forget to join me next time.